The library as a sanctuary. I used to spend countless hours at the library. It was my refuge, my place of escape. The world outside was full of distractions, crowded dorms, constant noise, and the endless social obligations that came with being a college student. But when I stepped into the library, everything changed. The air was different, heavier in a comforting way, like it was thick with the knowledge of centuries. It wasn't the newest, most modern building on campus, but that only made it feel more ancient, more full of wisdom. The floors creaked as if they had witnessed countless students and scholars, their footsteps echoing in the long corridors of old, their research forgotten in the pages of long-forgotten books. But to me, it felt like home. I had my favorite corner, by the windows in the back. The light coming through the dusty glass was soft, just enough to keep my eyes from straining while reading or typing away on my laptop. From this vantage point, I could look out over the campus, watching the students scurry about, oblivious to the vast ocean of knowledge housed just behind the walls of the library. And no matter the time of day, I always felt like I could focus, here. The murmur of the library's atmosphere, the rustling of pages, the soft thud of a book being returned to the shelf, the faint clicking of keyboards, formed a kind of peaceful symphony. It wasn't complete silence, but it was the perfect balance between stillness and gentle activity. I often found myself spending late hours at the library, especially during exam season when the pressure of assignments, projects, and looming tests weighed on me. There was something almost magical about those late-night study sessions. Most students had gone home or were hanging out with friends, and I could hear only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, the rustle of paper, and the turning of pages. It was just me and the books. But one night, everything changed. I remember the exact moment it happened. I had been there for hours, as usual, surrounded by textbooks and notes, trying to power through a research paper. The air in the library felt different, though. It wasn't as crisp as usual. Instead, there was a strange heaviness to it, like a storm was brewing outside, though the night sky was clear. I could feel the temperature in the room drop, and it wasn't just from the air conditioning. The soft flickering of the lights overhead seemed to echo in my ears, a rhythmic, unsettling pattern that wasn't quite right. Still, I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing. After all, I'd been working long hours and was probably just tired. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered in the back of my mind, an ever-present hum that wouldn't let me focus. I kept glancing up from my notes, scanning the room for any sign of movement, but it was just the usual rows of empty tables and towering shelves filled with forgotten knowledge. And yet, there was something different about it tonight. I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't just the silence or the emptiness of the library. It was as though the space itself was alive, aware of me. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes, trying to push aside the creeping unease. But then, as I exhaled and looked up once more, I noticed something. A faint shadow shifting in the corner of my eye. It was gone in an instant, but I felt it. It was a presence. Something watching. At first, I chalked it up to my tired eyes. I had been staring at my screen for too long, the exhaustion of studying for hours clouding my judgment. But then I noticed it again. This time, it wasn't just a flicker. It was a definite shift in the air around me. The temperature had dropped significantly. My breath became visible, as if the air had turned colder all of a sudden. I instinctively wrapped my arms around myself as if trying to ward off an invisible chill that had crept up behind me. I glanced around the room, my pulse quickening. The library, once my sanctuary, now felt different. The shelves seemed to loom taller, the shadows darker. It was as though the space had grown or perhaps shrunk all at once. My mind raced. Was it the lights flickering again? Perhaps the building was old and the wiring was faulty. But there was a quiet stillness now, an unsettling stillness, as though the library had become a mausoleum. There were no other students in sight, just the faint rustling of a page turning from a far-off table. The echo of my own breath was the loudest sound. My eyes kept darting to the corners of the room. as if expecting to see someone standing just beyond the shadows. But no one was there. There was a strange emptiness that seemed to press in from all sides. It was as if the library was too large, now, too vast for the people who inhabited it. There was an oppressive silence that seemed to wrap itself around me, choking the air from my lungs. For the first time since I'd started coming here, I felt small, insignificant even. I tried to focus again, trying to ignore the creeping feeling that had taken root in my mind, but it wouldn't go away. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. It was like a cold hand pressing against the back of my neck, lingering there, waiting. And it wasn't just the physical sensations that were unnerving. There was a psychological weight to it too. The library felt like it was watching me. The shelves, the books, they felt alive somehow, like they knew I was there, and they were aware of what I was doing. And then came the whisper. It was faint, so quiet that I thought I had imagined it. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe another student speaking in the distance. But then, the whisper came again, clearer this time. My name, soft, barely audible, but distinct. It was like the sound of someone calling to me from the depths of the library. I froze. Did someone say my name? I whispered aloud, scanning the room once again. There was no one. I sat there, frozen in place, trying to make sense of what was happening. My heart pounded in my chest and my palms were sweating. It felt like a nightmare, the kind where you're aware of your surroundings but can't move. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The library had always been a place of peace, a place of focus, but now it felt foreign, sinister, as though it no longer wanted me there. The whisper came again. This time it was louder. A soft, seductive tone, curling around my senses like smoke. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Something made me feel like I couldn't just walk away, like whatever was in the library wasn't done with me yet. The air in the library had become almost suffocating, the weight of it pressing on my chest with every breath I took. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. It wasn't just a lingering sensation of being watched. It was something far more real, far more terrifying. It was as though the space around me had shifted. The bookshelves seemed to loom larger now, their towering forms casting strange, deep shadows that moved in the periphery of my vision. I tried to focus on my work, pushing through the sense of dread, but the longer I sat there, the harder it became to ignore. That's when I saw it. A movement. At first it was so subtle I thought I had imagined it. My eyes darted to the corner of the room where the long row of shelves met the wall. There, in the darkness between two bookshelves, something shifted. The shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if it were a living thing, moving of its own accord. I blinked and it was gone. I tried to convince myself that it was just the lighting, the way the shadows fell at odd angles in the dimly lit space. But no matter how I looked at it, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something there, something that shouldn't have been. My fingers hovered over my laptop keyboard, frozen. I wanted to look away, to pretend it didn't happen, but my gaze was fixed on that spot in the room. The movement hadn't been a trick of the light, it was too deliberate, too real. With a sudden jolt of fear, I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. I walked slowly toward the aisle where I had seen the movement, each step heavy and reluctant. The soft, muted sound of my footsteps on the old wooden floor echoed through the stillness, amplifying the sense of isolation that was beginning to overwhelm me. As I passed each row of shelves, I couldn't help but feel that they were closing in on me, pushing me toward the center of the room, toward that unsettling spot where the shadow had been. When I reached the end of the row, I stopped dead in my tracks. The aisle was empty. The shadow was gone. I looked down both directions, my heart thudding loudly in my chest. There was nothing there. No figure, no sign of movement, just the quiet hum of the library. But despite the emptiness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the room, my body tense with anxiety. Was I imagining things? Was my Mind playing tricks on me? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that it didn't matter if I had seen something or not. The fear that had gripped me was real, and that fear was enough to make me feel like someone, was waiting just beyond my sight. The sensation of being watched grew more intense, more suffocating with each passing minute. I couldn't ignore it any longer. It was as if invisible eyes were fixed on me, following every movement, every breath I took. The cold air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin, seeping into my bones. My muscles tensed involuntarily, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't a normal feeling of unease. This was different. It was primal, an instinctive knowing that something was wrong. I turned slowly, trying to scan the empty library, but there was no one there, not a single person. The shelves, though filled with books, seemed to stretch further than they should, creating a vast maze of towering wooden structures. The shadows were longer now, stretching across the floor like dark fingers, reaching out to claim the space. Every corner seemed to hide something, every dark nook seemed to whisper my name. "Is anyone here?" I asked, my voice a hoarse whisper, barely audible above the eerie silence. But there was no response. Nothing but the quiet hum of the lights and the creaking of the wooden floor beneath my feet. I took a few steps forward, my heart pounding. In my chest, my body stiff with anxiety, and then there it was again, a whisper. This time it was clearer, unmistakable. "Come closer." The voice was soft, barely audible, but it was there. A strange, eerie voice that seemed to curl around my mind like smoke. It was my name, it whispered, but it was no one I recognized. It wasn't the voice of a friend or a stranger, it was something else, something otherworldly. The words didn't make sense. Why was it calling me closer? What did it want from me? I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The room seemed to grow darker, as though the shadows were closing in on me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run, to get out of the library and never come back. But my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, rooted to the spot as the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Come closer." The voice beckoned again, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I wanted to so badly to escape from the oppressive weight of the air around me, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The fear that had settled in my chest was suffocating, and no matter how hard I tried to will myself to leave, I couldn't. I felt trapped. The library had always been a place of refuge, a safe haven where I could escape from the chaos of the outside world. But now, it felt like a prison, a place that held me captive, waiting to reveal whatever dark secret it had been hiding. It was as if the library itself was alive and aware of my presence, of my vulnerability. I was no longer just a student studying late into the night. I was a victim, a plaything in whatever ancient, malevolent force inhabited these walls. Don't know what happened after that. My mind was a blur, and every moment felt like it was stretching out, distorting time itself. The whispers continued, relentless in their call, but something inside me snapped. I turned away from the aisle where the voices were coming from and tried to move deeper into the library. But the feeling of being watched only intensified, and then I saw it. A figure. It stood at the end of the aisle, almost blending into the darkness of the far corner. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline indistinct, as if it was made from shadow itself. The dim light from the overhead lamps barely touched it, casting it in a dark silhouette that seemed to shift with the movement of the shadows. It was as if the figure was both there and not there at the same time, an apparition born from the library's ancient walls. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the figure, unable to move. I couldn't bring myself to scream, to call out for help. The figure remained still, watching me with an unsettling presence. It didn't make a sound, it didn't move. But I could feel its gaze fixed on me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet wouldn't budge. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mix of fear and curiosity. The figure didn't seem to approach me, nor did it vanish. It just stood there, an impossible presence in the otherwise empty library. The space around me felt colder now, the silence heavier, The longer I stood there, the more it seemed as though the very air in the library was thickening, becoming more oppressive. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart racing in my chest before I finally broke free from my trance. My legs moved before my mind could process the decision, and I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I don't remember how I made it to the exit, but suddenly I was standing in front of the library door, my body shaking with the adrenaline coursing through me. The faint whisper still echoed in my mind, the strange, otherworldly voice calling me from the depths of the library. I felt as though I was still being pursued, as if the figure from the corner of my eye was right behind me. My hand fumbled with the door handle, desperate to escape, but the door wouldn't open. I pulled harder, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. At first, I thought I was just too disoriented, that my brain was playing tricks on me. Perhaps I was pushing the wrong door. The library's layout was confusing, with multiple exits that all led to different hallways, and I had been so frantic that I hadn't paid attention to which door I was near. But when I tried the handle again, my heart sank. The door wasn't locked. It simply refused to open. I tugged and pulled, my breath coming faster now, but nothing worked. The library's silence had thickened to a suffocating weight around me, and my senses were heightened to the point where every creak of the wood, every distant rustle of a page turning seemed to reverberate in my skull. I turned, desperate now, scanning the room. The dark figure had vanished, but I still felt its presence in every corner of the room. The shelves seemed to shift, to grow taller in the dim light, casting unnatural shadows that reached toward me, threatening to envelop me. I was trapped, felt a wave of dizziness, and tried the door one more time. Still nothing. My fingers were numb from the cold, my hands slick with sweat. It felt like hours, but in reality only minutes had passed. And then, just as I was about to give up, I heard it. The faintest scrape, like nails dragging against wood, coming from the other side of the door. My blood ran cold. The sound was too deliberate, too calculated, and I couldn't help but feel that whatever was on the other side of that door had been waiting for me, watching me struggle to escape. I stumbled back, my feet catching on the floor as my body screamed at me to run. But where would I go? The library had become a maze, every hallway a dead end, every door a trap. There was nowhere safe. I was no longer in control of my surroundings. The library had become its own entity, and I was nothing more than a trespasser in its endless darkened halls. The door was still locked, and I had no choice but to turn away from it, my pulse racing as I backed away from the exit. I could hear it now, the whispers, not just one voice, but many. They swirled around me, coming from every direction. The tilar sound was soft at first, like distant murmurs, but soon the voices became clearer, louder. They were no longer whispers, they were commands. Stay. Look. Don't leave. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the voices, but they were inside my head, not just in the air around me. It was as if they were coming from the walls themselves, the very structure of the library feeding the sound into my brain, forcing me to listen. Every word felt like a weight on my chest, pushing me deeper into the depths of this nightmare. I had no idea where the voices were coming from, but I could feel them all around me. They weren't just speaking. They were pulling me in. I turned, searching the room, my heart hammering in my chest. Every shadow seemed to stretch further now, as though they were closing in on me. The shelves, once comforting and familiar, now felt like they were alive, towering over me, their dark recesses filled with unseen eyes. The air had turned thick again, and I could feel something cold and wet against my skin. I glanced down, and my heart stopped. There on the floor around me was a thin layer of mist, gray and swirling, creeping slowly from the cracks in the floorboards. It was spreading, inch by inch, moving toward me like a living thing. I wanted to scream, but my throat had gone dry. The air was suffocating now, and the whispers continued, growing more frantic, more insistent. My body felt as though it was betraying me, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was no escape. The library had become an unholy labyrinth, and I was its prey. I don't know how much longer I stood, There, trapped in the oppressive silence, listening to the voices. It felt like days, though I knew it had only been hours. The cold mist had fully enveloped me, crawling up my legs, making my skin burn as it touched me. The whispers now seemed to echo in my skull, making it hard to think clearly. But then came the sound that froze my blood. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps. The footsteps echoed from the far end of the library, deliberate, methodical, growing louder as they approached. The shadow from earlier, the tall, dark figure, had begun to move. But it was no longer just an immobile silhouette. The figure had come to life. It walked toward me, slow and purposeful, its shape still indistinct, its movements inhuman. It wasn't walking like a person. It was dragging itself across the floor, its limbs stiff and jerky, as though it wasn't quite sure how to move. I could feel it now, the weight of its gaze on me, the unbearable pressure that seemed to radiate from its form. It didn't speak, it didn't need to. It was the embodiment of everything I feared, silent, dark, and filled with a terrible intent. The mist thickened around its feet, and the library seemed to shift once more, closing in, narrowing the space between us. I wanted to run. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen in place, my legs shaking, my heart pounding. The figure was getting closer now, its unnatural movements dragging it toward me. I could feel the cold emanating from it, the palpable sense of dread that followed it like a shadow. And then as it reached me, its hands, dark, skeletal, and impossibly long, reached out to me. The whispers grew louder now, deafening in their urgency. "Join us," they hissed. The figure was right in front of me. Its face, or what should have been its face, was nothing more than a void, an empty darkness where eyes should have been. It leaned toward me, its cold breath brushing against my face. My mind screamed in terror, but my body was paralyzed, trapped in the cold grip of fear. And then, just as it reached for me, the lights flickered. The entire library seemed to tremble, and with a loud, thunderous bang, the lights went out.